Before we step into the story, tell us in the comments where in the world you are watching from, and subscribe if this kind of story speaks to you.
The one you are about to hear is one you will not soon forget. One quiet morning, Harlan Crow stood at the foot of the steps outside the townhouse he had bought with his own hands years earlier. From the balcony above, his wife Vivian threw every piece of his clothing out the bedroom window. The last shirt drifted down and landed at his boots. He looked up, his face carrying the same expression it always had: quiet, observant, completely composed. Neighbors appeared at their windows. A woman walking her dog paused on the far curb.
Vivian leaned over the railing and announced, loud enough for the entire block to hear, that she wanted him out soon and that he needed to find somewhere else to live.
There was another man inside. Harlan could see the silhouette moving behind the curtain. She had already decided the townhouse was hers. The joint account was hers, and the future she had spent more than a year carefully arranging belonged entirely to her. What she did not know, what no one standing on that sidewalk could have known, was that just days earlier Harlan had received a call from an estate attorney in Savannah.
His great-uncle, Elias Crow, a man who had spent decades quietly building timberland, commercial holdings, and mineral rights across several states, had passed away.
Harlan was the sole heir to an estate valued at $800 million. She threw his clothes from the balcony that morning.
Within a short time the paperwork was signed.
What followed would cost her everything she thought she had already won. Harlan's days had always begun early. A thermos of black coffee on the seat beside him in his work truck. He was a general contractor who had started with small residential jobs and steadily grown his company into commercial retrofits and mid-sized developments across the city.
His truck carried the miles of honest work.
His boots were marked with dried concrete.
His business cards were plain, the lettering chosen for clarity rather than impression.
His great-uncle had taught him that the man who needs you to see what he owns usually has less than he wants you to believe. He had married Vivian years earlier. She was sharp and socially precise, the kind of woman who understood the temperature of a room the moment she entered it.
She had come from modest means and carried a great deal of ambition, something Harlan had respected.
She wanted a life that looked a certain way, and he had worked to give it to her.
What he had only recently begun to understand was the difference between building a life and performing one. The first signs had been small enough to explain away. A perfume he did not recognize that appeared one season and was gone the next. A text notification glimpsed from across the room. A name he did not know. A message preview warm enough to register and brief enough to dismiss.
He had said nothing. He was not a man who spoke before he understood the full picture. The signs grew larger.
One evening, he returned from a job site to find the house unusually clean. A candle burning in the living room, and Vivian on the back porch with her phone pressed to her ear. Her voice low in the way it became when she was managing something she did not want interrupted. She had hung up the moment she heard the door. She came inside and asked how the site had gone. He told her it had gone fine.
In the inside pocket of his work jacket, folded and refolded until the crease was soft, was a letter. It had arrived days earlier from a law firm in Savannah. He had read it twice while sitting in his truck in a hardware store parking lot. Engine off, then folded it away and driven to the job. He had told no one, not even Vivian. One detail he had not overlooked in all the months of watching was the small security camera he had installed above the garage door a couple of years earlier after a neighbor's toolbox was stolen. It covered the front approach and recorded to a cloud account in his name only. Standing on the sidewalk with his shirts at his feet, he thought of that camera for the first time in a long while. He gathered his clothes with the same methodical patience he brought to everything. He folded them, placed them in the bed of his truck, and drove to a hotel downtown. He checked in, set his thermos on the desk by the window, and opened his laptop. The cloud account held weeks of motion-triggered footage. He began at the beginning and worked forward, not rushing. He was looking for a pattern, not a single moment. Engineers look for patterns.
A single data point is an anomaly. A pattern is a structure.
He found it within a few evenings of review. A silver sedan appeared in the peripheral range of the driveway camera on multiple occasions over the recent weeks. It never parked directly in front. It always arrived after 6 in the evening on nights when Harlan was working late or staying overnight at job sites out of town.
The car left before morning each time. He ran the partial plate through a vehicle lookup service he had used before for contractor work.
The registration came back to Derek Lang, a commercial real estate broker based in Buckhead.
Harlan nodded once at the name and kept watching.
Weeks earlier, he caught a clear frame of Derek Lang walking through the front door of the townhouse with a key. His face remained perfectly calm. He moved to the financial records.
He pulled up the joint checking account and went back through the recent months.
What he found was not dramatic in any single instance.
It accumulated the way structural damage does, slow and invisible until the load shifts. There were transfers to an account he did not recognize. There were charges at a jewelry store he had never visited and a weekend hotel stay that coincided with the weekend Vivian had said she was visiting a college roommate out of town.
He built a spreadsheet. He entered every questionable entry by date and amount.
When he totaled the column, the figure was substantial.
He photographed the screen and forwarded the statements to his business email. He moved with the same deliberate calm that defined every action. He searched Derek Lang's name alongside Vivian's on every public platform he could reach. Most of her accounts were private, but a mutual acquaintance had tagged them both in a photograph from a rooftop gathering several months earlier.
During a stretch when Harlan had been away on an extended out-of-town job,
they stood 2 people apart in the frame. That distance was more careful than friendship. It was the distance of people who had agreed on something. The next day, while Vivian was at work, he let himself into the townhouse with the spare key he had never mentioned keeping. On the desk in their shared home office, tucked beneath a stack of interior design magazines, was a manila folder. Inside was a consultation summary from a family law attorney dated weeks earlier. In the margins, in Vivian's handwriting, was a preliminary division of assets. The townhouse was listed as a shared marital asset.
His contracting business was noted as potentially subject to valuation.
At the bottom of the page she had written, "Check if he has retirement accounts." He photographed every page.
He replaced the folder exactly where he had found it.
He drove back to the hotel, sat at the desk by the window, and opened the letter from the Savannah law firm once more.
He read through the full valuation.
$800 million in land, timber rights, commercial real estate, and liquid holdings accumulated over decades by a man who had worn overalls to bank meetings.
The estate had been structured with the specific intention of passing intact to a single named heir.
That heir was Harlan.
Under the law, it was classified as separate property in its entirety. Vivian's name appeared nowhere in the documents.
It never had. Elias Crow had met her once at a family gathering and had quietly revised the will shortly afterward,
specifying that the inheritance would pass to Harlan as his sole and separate property under any circumstance, including divorce.
The attorney who had drafted the revision had not asked why. The inherited estate was entirely protected.
Vivian would receive nothing from it regardless of how any divorce proceeded.
The townhouse had been purchased before the marriage. The title had always been in Harlan's name alone. She had never signed the deed.
She had simply assumed otherwise.
He had never corrected her. That same day, he drove to see his Aunt Ruth, the last of Elias Crow's generation still living. She met him at the door with both hands on his face and held him there for a moment before letting him inside. She had sweet tea already poured.
She did not wait for him to explain. "Your uncle told me," she said.
"About the will?"
"About all of it." Harlan sat.
He wrapped both hands around the glass. "He also told me about your wife," Ruth said. He looked at her carefully. "He was old, but he was not careless," she said.
"He hired someone to look into things."
"She had been moving pieces around, trying to find the door. She believed you had more than you showed." Harlan was quiet for a moment. "She wasn't wrong that there was a door," he said. "No," Ruth answered.
She just didn't know she was already standing inside.
What she was looking for. She set her glass
down and looked at him with the steady patience of someone who had seen a great deal and mourned the right things. "Your
great uncle used to say you could." Tell the character of a person by what they reached for when they
thought nobody was watching. She paused.
She was reaching Harlan. She just reached in the wrong direction. He drove back to the city that evening and went to work. He met with his corporate attorney the following morning and initiated a formal review of the joint account, documenting every questionable transfer and charge as a complete record. Lenora's family law associate filed a preliminary protective response to a divorce petition that had not yet been formally submitted, a clean, precise measure that ensured Vivian could not move a single asset without it being immediately visible to opposing counsel. He also placed a quiet call to the commercial property
manager who handled a building on Peachtree
Street where Derek Lang's real estate brokerage kept its office. That building, as part of the recent estate transfer, was now one of the commercial properties Harlan owned outright. Derek Lang was a tenant in a building his lover's husband now controlled.
A certified letter went out the next day informing him that his lease renewal would not be extended.
The letter cited a portfolio restructuring under new ownership and included the name of the new owner. Harlan made a note.
He filed it that evening. He called Vivian and told her calmly that he was coming by to collect a few more things and that he hoped they could handle the situation like adults. She agreed in the tone of someone who believed she had already won.
He made dinner. He reheated a rice dish she had prepared earlier in the week. He ate at the counter.
She sat at the table and looked at her phone.
She asked if he had found a place to stay.
He told her he was managing. She did not look up. He washed his dish, said good night, and drove back to the hotel. He slept soundly.
Some things, when they are already built correctly, do not require noise to hold. The mediation was held at Lenora's office. It had been framed to Vivian's attorney as a standard asset review proceeding, a no-contest divorce filing. Vivian arrived with her attorney, composed and deliberate, wearing the grey blazer she wore to presentations she intended to control. Derek Lang was not present. He had been informed the previous evening by certified letter that his lease would not be renewed.
According to Vivian's later account, he had said very little and hung up. Harlan was already seated when they entered.
Lenora sat to his right. His corporate attorney, Quentin, sat to his left. The estate files rested on the table in a grey folder, closed.
Vivian's attorney opened with the standard points: the duration of the marriage, shared assets, the marital residence.
He referred to the townhouse as jointly occupied marital property.
He nodded toward the joint checking account.
He mentioned the contracting business and stated his client's interest in a fair valuation. Harlan let him finish.
Lenora opened the grey folder, placed the first document on the table, and slid it across. Vivian's attorney picked it up.
He read the first page. He turned to the second.
He set it down and looked at Harlan for a moment with the expression of a man recalibrating everything he had been prepared to argue. Vivian reached over and took the document herself. Harlan watched her read it. He watched her eyes stop on the valuation line. He watched her read it again. He watched understanding move across her face, not all at once, but in stages. Like light shifting when a cloud passes and you realize the day had been darker than you knew. $800 million, Lenora said, is the current assessed value of the estate Harlan inherited from his great-uncle Elias Crowe. The estate was established and held entirely in the family trust long before this marriage. Under the law, it is classified as separate property in its entirety.
It was not mingled.
It was not contributed to the marriage.
His name is the only name on it. It always has been. Vivian set the document down.
Lenora placed a second document on the table. This is the deed to the townhouse. You will note the title was transferred to Harlan's name in the year he purchased it before the marriage.
His name alone.
Vivian has never been on the deed. Vivian looked at her attorney. Her attorney was reading. Lenora placed a third document on the table. This is a financial summary of the joint marital account documenting substantial transfers
and charges your client made to accounts and expenditures not shared with my client and not disclosed to him. We are not pursuing recovery. We are placing it on record. The room was quiet.
Vivian's attorney said he would need a moment to consult with his client. Vivian was not looking at him.
She was looking at Harlan with an expression he had never seen from her before, stripped of the social precision she carried everywhere, reduced to something raw and unguarded and too late. She said his name. He looked at her without anger, without satisfaction, with the same expression he had worn on the sidewalk when her clothes landed at his feet. "I didn't know," she said. He let the silence hold for a moment. "You didn't ask," he said. That was always the difference between us. He stood. He buttoned his jacket. He picked up his phone and his keys. He looked once at Lenora, who gave him the smallest nod. He left the room without looking back. The hallway was cool and quiet. The elevator came immediately. He rode it down alone, walked through the lobby, and stepped out onto the street into a morning already full of ordinary motion cars, pedestrians, a construction crew working on the facade across the way. He stood there for a moment and watched two workers set a cornerstone into place with a level and a rubber mallet, tapping it down until it held. Then he drove to a job site and checked the structural progress on a retaining wall his crew had poured the day before. It was clean. The angles were true. The drainage channels ran exactly where the plans called for them. In the months that followed, Harlan moved back into the townhouse. He repainted the living room a deep, warm grey. He pulled up the carpet in the back bedroom and replaced it with hardwood. He had milled himself from timber on family landwood that had been growing long before any of the trouble that had come and gone. He built a new deck of the back of the house, working alone in the early hours before the heat settled in. Each board was set level and true. He stood on it most evenings now with a glass of water and watched the light leave the sky. He met Sophia at a professional association dinner. She was a structural engineer with a firm downtown. She had opinions about load distribution and asked him questions about timber construction that required him to think before answering. She had not performed for him once in the months he had known her. He was not in a rush. She appeared not to be either. The first phase of the estate's commercial portfolio restructuring was complete. Lenora had assembled a management team to oversee operations. The timberland was under new sustainable harvest contracts. The commercial properties were fully leased and professionally managed. Harlan established a foundation in his great-uncle's name focused on construction trade education for young men from working-class backgrounds. The first cohort was already enrolled. He heard about Vivian through a mutual acquaintance. She had left the city early the following year and relocated for a regional sales position that paid considerably less than the role she had left behind. The townhouse sale had netted her nothing. Her name had never been on the deed. The joint account had been closed at mediation. Her attorney had extracted her from the process with minimal exposure and considerably less compensation than she had mapped out in her own handwriting weeks before Harlan photographed those pages. Derek Lang had relocated as well. His brokerage had folded within weeks of losing the Peaktree office. He was last heard from doing independent consulting from an apartment in another state. No firm name, no associates listed. Harlan heard all of this in the time it took to walk from one end of a job site to the other. He filed it in the same place he filed everything that had already been resolved back and down where it belonged. He was in the workshop behind the house one morning when the early light came in low through the single east-facing window. He was sanding a piece of walnut he intended to use for a small side table, moving with the grain in slow, even strokes, turning the wood in his hands until the surface was smooth enough to hold the finish properly. A cardinal moved through the oak at the back of the yard and was gone. He had built everything worth keeping. I hope you enjoyed that one. If it stayed with you, give it a like and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've already picked out two more I think you'll find just as powerful.